Hello and welcome to Trees, the Silent Sentinels. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm delighted that you have chosen to spend the next 30 minutes with my guest as they now go in search of trees around our beautiful island, Barbados. Once again, I pause to thank all of you for your kind words of support and, of course, your constructive criticism of the series. They have all been well received. In last week's program, Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, Dr. John Webster and Carla Daniel discussed the almond tree, the sea grape tree and the West Indian white cedar. Barney Gibbs, who introduced us to the Mafada breadfruit in a previous program, listed a number of trees that are good for the coastal area. We also started our discussion about mangroves and the important role they play in protecting the landscape of the island. In fact, the discussion ended with Carla calling attention to the hole in Holetown and reminding all of the importance of its gully as a watercourse for the land. Now, speaking about mangroves, in this week's program we shall take a look at trees as silent sentinels for birds. We begin our tour with Dr. John Webster, who has studied and written about trees and birds. It is an interesting story about a known bird which, because of our destruction of the mangroves, took flight. Thankfully, it has found another silent sentinel.
This is an example I'll give you of why trees are important to one species of bird. All along the west coast we used to have mangrove trees by all the little bays and ponds, and probably the only real remaining example of them now is at the hole in Holetown. Those were very important for the yellow warbler. Yellow warbler is a beautiful yellow bird. It also existed at Graham Hall Swamp, where there are lots of mangrove trees. Back in the 60s, I think it was, there was a major cutback of the mangrove trees in Graham Hall. And over time, we have lost virtually all of our mangroves along the west coast. What that meant is the habitat for the yellow warbler had significantly decreased, and it was almost extirpated on the island, which means it was almost extinct in Barbados. There was quite a drive at the time to save the yellow warbler. And I think that was back in the late 80s, early 90s. Interestingly, with the introduction of the river Tamarind, which has in some ways become almost a noxious pest, the yellow warbler has found a new habitat. There is a small moth that has taken the river Tamarind as their source to survive on. So they have a symbiotic relationship, the moth, which produces caterpillars. The caterpillars are an ideal food for the yellow warbler. So now we have a huge population of yellow warblers all over the island, and they're really beautiful. They sing beautifully, and they're very pretty.
We cannot speak about mangroves as a habitat for birds without making mention of the last remaining mangrove found at the Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary in Christchurch, Barbados. It is the last example of the numerous coastal swamps which once dotted the leeward coast of Barbados, from Spikestown on the northwestern coast to Chancery Lane Swamp just south of the airport. Over the years, the swamps have been filled in for commercial development, killing all of the wildlife that depended upon them. Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary is the last significant mangrove swamp in Barbados, and its international importance as a reserve and as a staging post for thousands of migratory birds was recognized by it being declared a Ramsar wetland.
Behind me, you can see lots of mangroves surrounding the swamp. And the mangroves here serve the purpose of providing places for birds to roost. And here we have several different types of egrets and herons. The cattle egrets tend to roost in the area out at that end of the swamp. And if we pan across here, we'll see two mangrove islands. And those mangrove islands have a special significance in the birding world. Sometime around the mid-1990s, the little egret was discovered to be breeding in this island, the first occurrence of little egret breeding in the Western Hemisphere. The little egret population seems to have declined somewhat, but we think there's still some breeding in that particular location there on those mangrove islands. We also have snowy egrets that breed here, and many other egrets come to roost here, egrets and herons. We've seen little blue herons, great blue herons. We've even had the very rare purple heron here a few years ago. The mangrove swamp is important because the mangroves also serve to keep the water clean.
Trees as silent sentinels for the water in the swamp. There are a few spots on the island that are roost for the cattle egret. Unfortunately, we tend to see these birds as pests and opt to destroy their habitat, the trees. But on the contrary, the cattle egrets are not pests, they feed on pests.
People tend to consider the cattle egret like a pest, but actually cattle egret is an amazing bird because it feeds on things like mice. Now, it feeds on centipedes, which are not necessarily a pest to us, but we don't like to get bit by centipedes. If you ever follow a tractor that's plowing a field, you will see dozens or sometimes hundreds of them following the tractor. And if you look carefully at what they're catching all the little vermin, little mice and whatnot that are running out as the field is being plowed. They're catching centipedes. You'll see them in pastures catching grasshoppers and all sorts of pests they feed on. So the cattle egret is not a true pest. It's actually quite a helpful bird. And there are several roosts on the island where they exist.
The roosts are simply trees, the silent sentinels for birds. John takes us to a roost in the north of the island. Now, because of the tendency for some among us to stone the birds and shoot them as a sporting activity, we have opted not to disclose the exact location in the north of the island.
As we can hear in the background, there are dozens or hundreds of egrets at their nesting site over on this side of the pond. And many of the trees around this pond are actually mahogany trees. Several of them have been defoliated by the birds nesting in them, and their fecal droppings are very acidic and have essentially defoliated the trees to the extent that some of them are actually dying. So eventually the leaves shed, they can't photosynthesize anymore. So the plant is essentially killed by its leaves being defoliated. Over on the side of the pond behind me, we have what is essentially their roost tree. If you come here at night, well, as night approaches, within the half an hour approaching night, you will see hundreds of cattle egrets that come here to roost. And I've counted well over 700 in the tree across the pond behind me. That is a ficus tree, whereas many of the other trees are actually mahogany trees. Trees are really important for birds to roost. That's where they go to sleep and to nest. And as we look closer at the trees to my right, we will see some of the nesting sites of the cattle egret. This pond has also been proven last year to be the main source or main site at which the black crowned night herons have been roosting as well and producing young. That we've seen several nests here last year. So it's an important pond, both for the cattle egrets and the black crowned night herons. As we look across to my right here, we can clearly see the trees in which the cattle egrets have been nesting. And you can see how they have actually defoliated much of the trees. Some of them are actually dead or very close to being dead. And there are probably about 200 or 300 nests in those trees right there. The tree behind me on this this tree behind here is where they actually tend to roost at night. And that's where I've counted as many as 700 cattle egrets coming in to roost and sleep for the night. They tend to separate their roost from their nest site. So at this pond, they roost on the south side and they nest on the north side. In any location where you have a large number of birds occupying the same space, you'll often find dead birds hanging out of the tree. Many of them are juveniles or very young chicks, which may have fallen out the nest and can't get back in. Sometimes, people fly kites all around the place and leave the strings. And it's quite amazing how birds get tangled up in these strings and come back to the nesting site or the roost with a piece of string hanging onto their feet. And then it gets tied around a part of the tree and they literally hang themselves. I've seen several birds in this area that are hanging from a piece of string. So it's unfortunate when people are flying their kites that they leave all the strings and whatnot around, because it really leads to the death of many birds. And if you look into the shrubs and trees overhead, you can see numerous nests. As I said earlier, probably 200 or more nests at this location. And you'll see chicks of all different ages, from just hatched, those just about to fledge. And the noise here is quite something to experience. They have probably tripled the amount of nests that they had here from when I first started coming.
From this secret location in the north of the island, we travel to the south and visit another silent sentinel that is the habitat of the cattle egret.
Literally in the center of the oil fields of Barbados, in the Woodburn area in the southeast section of the island. And right behind me we have an egret roost. It's a Pride of India tree. As we look towards the tree, we can see there are numerous nests. There are well over 100 nests in this tree. And the egrets are literally oblivious to us being here because they're so focused on raising their young. As you can see, they're flying backwards and forwards. Some are being fed, some are sitting on their nests. While we're on the topic of birds and how the trees are valuable for birds, as a birder, bird photographer myself, I often go to Harrison Point. Now Harrison Point has a lot of mature trees. It also has lots of what Barbadians call bush. And some of them are young river tamarins. The place is somewhat overgrown, but it is a vital location for migrating songbirds. And this last year, 2014, we found several rare migrating songbirds in that area and photographed them. We always find yellow-billed cuckoos in that area because they come looking for little caterpillars. We had several black-polled warblers, which some migrate through the island every year towards the latter months of the year, and they're running from the winter in North America. And it's amazing, these little tiny birds that come down and they stop off at Harrison Point for a refuel. They stop to rest, refuel, and then they're gone. Some only stop for a couple of hours. So we're fortunate when we see them, I actually can photograph them.
That is very important. The trees here at Harrison's Point, once the home of the United States Naval Facility, being used as silent sentinels for the migratory birds.
Another very important area is Turner's Hall Woods. Turner's Hall Woods is the last remaining 50 acres of Barbados of the original forest that covered this island before it was stripped away for the production of sugar 350 years ago. Just recently I had a walk through Turner's Hall Woods, and it was quite amazing. Lots of springs, it seems, so it was quite wet in Turner's Hall Woods. We spent 4 hours walking from the the St. Simon's end up to the top and back. We were looking specifically for a bird called the ovenbird, which is a migrating songbird, which had been seen there on Boxing Day by one of our fellow birders. We didn't find that, but we found what is called the Christmas bird. It's an American redstart, and it was the first one for me. I'd never seen one of those. But there are many other birds that are resident birds. Of the 46 species that are resident on the island, there are many others that you will find there. We heard and saw yellow warblers, of course the Barbados bullfinch, which is our endemic species, Carib grackles, the blackbirds, various doves, pigeons, the scaly-necked pigeon, and many of the species that may not be that visible but often heard, like the black-whiskered vireo and the pee-whittler, which people erroneously believe the gray king bird is the pee-whittler, but actually the pee-whittler is a Caribbean Elenia. And it's a smaller bird than the gray king bird, and that is often seen in the tree canopy. If we just look to my left here over the edges of the Scotland district, you see lots of forested areas that are secondary regrowth. All of that area would have been completely stripped by the colonizers when they were preparing the land to grow sugar. We're going to enter Turnstile Woods now, as it's the only remaining part of what is considered to be native vegetation of Barbados. Somehow that area survived, and it's an area of approximately 50 acres, and it has quite a diverse range of plants and shrubs and trees in it.
Dr. Claire Durant has a passion for trees and the environment, and this, of course, is borne out in almost every conversation with her. She now links the two, pointing to their overall sustainability and their place in the ecosystem of Barbados.
Turner's Hall is one of the most, is not one of the most, it is the most species-rich area, meaning that's the only place in Barbados that you would be able to see that. So having areas like that, it improves the climate. Having trees improves the climate because of the trees making the area cooler. It makes it better for us, and it also makes it better for all of the insects, all of the animals that we have. You know, the mongooses, the birds, they love the areas that have trees. If there were no trees, then what would the bees do? Where would the bees be able to pollinate and make those lovely watermelons that you like? If we didn't have any hummingbirds and sparrows going to all of the flowers and doing the pollination, then what would we have? So all of these things are things that are interlinked. So that's when we talk about the environment, we talk about keeping things together and improving things for the future. Everybody talks about green and sustainable. Trees are part of sustainability and improving the environment. And if we cut down trees and don't replace them, then that is not sustainable.
We have just entered Turnstile Woods. We're actually walking on what was originally a public road, believe it or not. The time and erosion and slippage has made it just a track now. It's an area where you can see what was an old bridge that used to cross a stream.
It's still got a little life in it, man. Anybody want to risk walking across one of these old 100-year-old rotten beams?
Yeah, me no.
Not a good idea. I saw at least one very good photo of someone like standing on this bridge from the 1960s. But when I first came and see the size and thickness of these logs, and then there was wood all the way across, so you could actually walk across casually without being afraid. When in the late 90s now, we had to like balance on one of those beams. I mean, being 14, 15, you're frightened for that, that's that deep. But it was just like a deer. Walking coming up, who take the bridge road, they would get a slight lead in terms of speed, and all the ones that are afraid will go down and come up around the other side.
Special memories of having to traverse the rugged terrain of Turner's Hall Woods by Julian, a resident of the area. Now, Julian is a plant specialist by profession, Turner's Hall Woods has been his stomping ground professionally and recreationally. He knows it well and has also retained the shared memories of his elder folks.
When it started, it was only like 300 yards wide by like half a mile long. And as we go down, I'm going to show you where the woods actually started back then, where the land was cultivated down to a certain point. And then beyond that, the guy Turner had it reserved. He even had a guard that used to keep guard and stop persons from cutting firewood and stuff down there. And I heard a lot of stories from the older guys in the area about how this man used to chase them from down in the woods and all that. So, but you know, boys gonna be boys. It's all government now, but in the past it was Turner's Hall Plantation. And a lot of the workers would have gotten, that's how Turner's Hall actually came about. Plantation would have given some of the workers some place to put the house.
Right, okay.
And then later on they sold off parts of it to different individuals that came back from Panama with a little piece of change. They buy a 2 acre here, a 4 acre there. This side, pretty much going south, would have been where the actual original Turner's Hall Woods would have started. Well, this land here was cultivated down to the bottom. This one behind us was cultivated. But then when you start to go up on that ridge, on that side of the ridge, that area, for a good stretch, almost down to St. Simon's, is where the original 300 yards wide by long would have been. So that's basically how Turner's Hall started to expand and grow up.
It's a fabulous place for migrating songbirds. And every year between October and late December, January, birders come here to look for migrating bird species such as ovenbirds, American redstarts, and several other songbird species that tend to stop off in Turner's Hall Woods because it's lovely forested area. They come here, they feed, they refresh, and they move further south. Some will actually overwinter here in Turner's Hall Woods. So it was quite an enlightening experience to go through Turner's Hall and to truly appreciate the importance of trees just for the birds.
That's where we leave it for this week. You have been introduced to trees as silent sentinels for birds as seen at a number of locations around the island. We also began our tour of species-rich Turner's Hall Woods. Do join us next week at the same time. Until then, I'm gone in search of more trees.